No one in the town would ever forget the night when a newborn's cry echoed over the river, only to be silenced by a splash that froze every heart. It wasn't the storm clouds rolling above, nor the roar of the river that haunted them most. It was the sight of a wealthy man, a man they all respected, standing coldly on the bridge, his hands trembling not with regret, but with anger. What he didn't know, what he could never have predicted, was that a pair of eyes were watching from the riverbank. Eyes as dark and deep as the midnight water. The white horse, the one they called Solace, saw everything. And when the infant's fragile body hit the current, when the river threatened to claim an innocent life, the horse did what no man dared to do, he leapt. That night, beneath lightning and betrayal, a story was written in water and courage. A story of innocence betrayed, of loyalty tested, and of justice carried not by human hands, but by hooves. The town of Willow Creek lay in the wide stretch of the American frontier, where the sun dipped into rolling hills and the river cut through the valley like a silver blade. Most days began in peace. Chickens clucked in the yards, children chased one another across dirt streets, and wagons creaked under the weight of hay bales. It was the kind of place where time slowed, where secrets whispered softer than the wind. At the center of it all stood a mansion too big for the land it occupied. Its white stone walls and iron gates were reminders that some people in Willow Creek were born not into struggle, but into fortune. Inside lived Charles Davenport, the richest man for miles. A man of tailored suits, polished boots, and a gaze sharp enough to make even seasoned ranchers drop their hats. But wealth didn't warm his heart. Behind his perfect smile was a man consumed by control and appearances. His business empire stretched across cattle, rail, and land deeds. He measured people by their usefulness, not their humanity. And when his wife gave birth to a frail little boy one autumn evening, Charles didn't see a miracle. He saw weakness. His wife, Eleanor, however, saw only love. She had been sick for months, pale and fragile, yet the moment she held the baby in her arms, her strength seemed to return. The boy was small, too small, with lungs that struggled against the air. But to Eleanor, he was perfect. She named him Samuel. It wasn't long before the mansion staff began whispering. Some feared Charles's temper, the way he looked at the child as though it were a burden chained to his future. They noticed how he avoided the nursery, how he tightened his jaw whenever Samuel cried. To him, a son was supposed to be strong, robust, a future heir to his empire. Instead, he saw fragility, dependency, and shame. Not everyone in that mansion turned away. In the stables, a white horse named Solace had long been Eleanor's companion. Tall, with a flowing mane that gleamed under sunlight, Solace was no ordinary horse to her, he was family. He had carried her across fields when her body was strong, stood still beside her during nights of grief, and now, in some strange way, seemed to sense the baby's presence too. When Eleanor wheeled Samuel's cradle to the garden, Solace would stretch his neck and breathe softly near the boy, ears flicking forward, eyes tender. The baby, weak as he was, always responded with a faint coo. It was as though two souls had found comfort in each other, one unable to speak, the other unable to speak in words. For a few weeks, the mansion lived in uneasy balance. Eleanor doted on Samuel, nurses attended quietly, and Charles buried himself in business. Yet shadows deepened with each passing day. His empire, though vast, was trembling under new debts. Investors pressed harder, deals fell through, and the whispers of weakness clung to him like smoke. A frail son, in his mind, became proof to the world that even his bloodline was flawed. And so, the stage was set. The town slept, the river flowed, and a white horse grazed in silence, waiting, though no one knew yet, to bear witness to the unthinkable. The night the river swallowed the sky began like any other in Willow Creek. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth. Crickets chirped, and somewhere in the distance, thunder growled like a warning. Inside the Davenport mansion, however, silence pressed against the walls. Eleanor lay weak in her bed, her fever returning after days of strain from childbirth. Nurses rushed about with cloths and bowls of water, but she only had strength for one question. "Where is Samuel?" Her voice trembled, eyes darting across the dimly lit room. She longed to hold her son close, to keep him warm against the chill of her own body. But Charles had entered earlier, demanding the baby be left with him for a midnight walk. The nurses, terrified of crossing their employer, obeyed. Down the marble staircase, Charles cradled his son with a grip too cold for tenderness. His face was unreadable, stone under candlelight. Servants peered nervously from behind corners, whispering in hushed tones. No one dared ask why a man who barely looked at his child suddenly wanted to take him out into the storm. Charles stepped into the stable yard where Solace, the white horse, stirred. The animal raised his head from the trough, ears pricking as his dark eyes fell upon the bundle in Charles's arms. The horse's nostrils flared, catching the faint scent of the newborn. He shifted, uneasy, hooves scraping against the dirt. "Back," Charles muttered, glaring at the horse as though it understood. "Stay where you are." But Solace didn't move. His gaze followed Charles as he crossed the yard, boots crunching on gravel, cloak billowing in the rising wind. The river lay just beyond the estate, its currents restless from the storm upstream. To most, it was a place of life, where children fished and women washed clothes on sunny days. But under the cloak of night, it became a maw of darkness, roaring and merciless. Charles reached the wooden bridge spanning the water. He paused, staring down at Samuel. The baby stirred, a weak whimper slipping past his lips. His tiny hands reached upward, as though seeking comfort, as though he somehow knew the heart above him had no warmth to give. "Pathetic," Charles whispered, his jaw tightening. "You'll ruin everything." His mind raced with images of investors mocking him, of rivals whispering about the Davenport heir who couldn't even breathe right. In his twisted logic, ending this fragile life was an act of strength, of cutting weakness from his bloodline before it spread. Behind him, hooves struck the ground. Solace had followed. The horse stood at the edge of the yard, head held high, mane whipping in the wind. His body trembled, not from fear, but from some instinct deeper than words. He knew. He knew something unnatural was about to happen. Charles turned, fury flashing in his eyes. "Go back," he barked. But Solace took a step forward. And then, it happened. In one motion, Charles lifted Samuel above the railing. The baby's cry pierced the storm, fragile and desperate. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the cruel determination carved into Charles's face. For a second, time seemed to hold its breath. Then he let go. The bundle fell, a streak of pale cloth against the night, and with a sickening splash, the river claimed it. The cry stopped. Only the roar of water remained. Charles exhaled, his chest heaving as though a great burden had been lifted. He leaned on the railing, watching as the current dragged the newborn downstream. His lips pressed into a line, not of regret, but of grim satisfaction. But he wasn't alone. A thunderous neigh shattered the air. Solace reared, hooves striking the ground with a force that echoed across the valley. His body quivered, eyes wide with terror and rage. And then, without hesitation, he bolted. The white horse charged toward the riverbank, mane flying like a banner in the storm. Charles spun around, startled, watching in disbelief as the animal cleared the fence and galloped straight to the water's edge. "No!" Charles shouted, but his voice was drowned by the storm. Solace reached the bank, hooves skidding on wet soil. He saw nothing but black water, swirling, merciless. His ears flicked forward, muscles tense. For one brief moment, he hesitated, not from doubt, but from calculation. The river was no place for a creature of the land. But the faint, muffled wail of a child broke through the roar. And Solace leapt. His massive body crashed into the river with a spray of white foam. The current seized him instantly, dragging him downstream. But he kicked, powerful legs cutting through water, nostrils flaring against the rush. His eyes darted, searching for the fragile bundle. On the bridge, Charles stood frozen, hands gripping the rail. Rage and disbelief collided in his chest. He hadn't considered this, hadn't imagined that a beast could undo what he had decided. His lips parted in a whisper, swallowed by the storm. Damn that horse! The river carried Solace further, tossing him between waves. But then, there. A shred of white cloth surfaced, bobbing helplessly. The horse surged forward, straining every muscle. With a thrust of his muzzle, he caught the fabric between his teeth, tugging the bundle from the water. Samuel was still alive. His cries, faint but piercing, rose above the thunder. Silas turned, battling the current, determination blazing in his eyes. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting for justice, for life itself. On the bank, servants had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Gasps and screams filled the night as they saw the scene unfold, the master of the house standing motionless on the bridge, and the white horse wrestling the river with a newborn clutched in his jaws. The storm raged, but something stronger raged within the beast. Inch by inch, Silas fought his way toward shore. By the time his hooves struck solid ground, Samuel's cries had weakened to a faint murmur. Silas laid the bundle gently on the grass, nudging it with his muzzle, as if urging the boy to breathe, to live. And Samuel did. He coughed, sputtered, and then let out a thin, desperate cry. A cry of survival. The servants rushed forward, gathering the child in trembling hands, tears streaming down their faces. Some fell to their knees, thanking heaven. Others turned toward the bridge, horror dawning in their eyes as they pieced together the truth. Charles Davenport stood in silence, rain pouring over him, his secret unraveling in front of those he once commanded. He had tried to bury his weakness. But the river, and the horse, refused to let him. The river still thundered, but on its banks, silence settled over the crowd. No one could look away from the scene before them, Samuel, shivering but alive in the arms of a trembling maid, and Silas, drenched, his mane plastered against his neck, standing tall despite the cold. Water streamed off his body, pooling into the soil. His breath came in heavy clouds, nostrils flaring as though he'd wrestled death itself, and won. The servants exchanged horrified glances, their whispers rippling like the wind through dry grass. He threw the baby. My God! I saw it with my own eyes. It was Mr. Davenport. On the bridge, Charles's jaw clenched. He realized the scene had slipped beyond his control. The eyes of his own household, once bound by fear and obedience, were now lit with something more dangerous, truth. Enough! Charles's voice cut through the storm, cold and commanding. Not another word. Do you hear me? But the order carried no weight. The sight of their master condemning his newborn had broken something inside the staff. Fear no longer chained their tongues. One of the stable boys, barely 16, stepped forward, his voice shaking. Sir, we saw. Everyone saw. The horse saw. Silas's ears flicked forward at the sound of his name. He lifted his head, eyes locking with Charles's. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the two of them, man and beast. One filled with rage, the other with defiance. Charles turned his glare away, unwilling to be measured by the gaze of an animal. But even he could feel it, Silas wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a witness. The baby whimpered again, the frail sound pulling the crowd's attention. The maid holding him cried openly, rocking him gently. He's still breathing, she whispered. Thanks be to God, he's still breathing. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating Silas in a halo of silver. The horse pawed the ground, his body trembling, not from fear but from an almost human intensity. He moved closer to the maid, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed the cloth bundle. Samuel quieted, as though recognizing the presence that had pulled him from death. The symbolism was too powerful to ignore, where his father had chosen betrayal, the horse had chosen loyalty. But Charles was not a man to yield. He descended from the bridge with heavy strides, mud splashing under his boots. His eyes burned, his voice slicing the night. You will all say nothing, he ordered, pointing at the gathered servants. Not to the town, not to anyone. Do you understand? You live under my roof, you eat my bread, you owe me your silence. The crowd shifted uneasily, but not one bowed. The spell of fear had shattered. What they had witnessed could not be contained. And Solace, still standing between Charles and the child, made sure of it. The horse stepped forward, muscles taut, his wet body gleaming under flashes of lightning. He positioned himself squarely in front of the maid holding Samuel, as though daring Charles to come closer. The audacity of it, the defiance of a beast, ignited something dangerous inside Charles. He raised his cane, fury spilling from him. "Out of my way, you damned animal!" But Solace didn't flinch. Instead, he reared, hooves slashing the air, a piercing neigh ripping through the storm. The ground shook as he landed, his hooves stamping just inches from Charles's boots. The servants gasped, some covering their mouths, others clutching each other. For the first time, Charles stepped back. The image burned into every witness's memory, the richest man in Willow Creek, retreating from the very horse he once claimed ownership over. It was no longer his. Solace belonged to something greater now, justice, truth, and the innocent life he had saved. The storm began to ease, the rain thinning to a mist. But tension clung to the night like smoke. Servants whispered among themselves, voices carrying resolve. "We have to tell the sheriff. He can't get away with this. The horse, he saved the child. He saw everything." Charles's eyes darted across the faces of his staff. He realized the truth was slipping out of his grasp. Rage twisted his features. "Do you think anyone will believe you? Against me? Against my name?" But it wasn't his name that carried weight now. It was the cries of Samuel, the loyalty of Solace, and the unity of those who had seen. The maid cradling Samuel pressed her lips to his damp forehead. "He's not weak," she whispered fiercely, though she knew Charles could hear. "He's strong. Stronger than you know. And he will live." Solace lowered his head beside her, his breath warming the newborn's cheek. It was as if the horse himself vowed the same. Charles's hand trembled on his cane, his power slipping through his fingers like sand. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came. For the first time, the richest man in town found himself silenced, not by men, not by money, but by the undeniable loyalty of a horse and the fragile cry of a child he had tried to erase. The crowd began to move, circling protectively around the maid, the baby, and the horse. Charles stood alone, isolated on the edge of the bridge. And as dawn's first light threatened the horizon, one truth settled over Willow Creek like a heavy curtain. Charles Davenport's empire was no longer built on stone and steel. It was collapsing under the weight of his own cruelty. Morning broke over Willow Creek with a sky painted in pale gold, but the town awoke to whispers darker than the night before. By dawn, word had already spread beyond the Davenport estate. The maids, shaken and sleepless, could not keep their silence. Stable boys carried the story like wildfire through the marketplace. The master threw his own child into the river. And the horse, God help us, the horse saved him. By mid-morning, the entire town buzzed with disbelief and horror. Some refused to believe at first. Charles Davenport, the man who had built the railway spur, who had donated the grand bell tower in the square. But doubt melted quickly when more servants came forward, their voices steady with conviction. And the final witness, though wordless, carried more weight than any testimony, Solace, the white horse. Eleanor awakens. Inside the mansion, Eleanor stirred at last. Her fever had broken with the first light, and she demanded her child immediately. When the nurse placed Samuel in her arms, wrapped in fresh linen, she pressed her lips to his tiny head and sobbed with relief. But when she asked how he had ended up in the arms of a maid, when she begged for the truth, silence filled the room. None of the servants could meet her eyes. Finally, the maid who had held Samuel the night before fell to her knees. "Forgive me, ma'am. It was Mr. Davenport. He tried to," her voice broke. "The horse saved him. Solace saved your boy." At first Eleanor didn't understand. Then the words sank in, and her face drained of color. She clutched Samuel tighter, rocking him, her tears falling hot and fast. No, it cannot be." But deep inside, she had known. She had seen the way Charles looked at Samuel, with disdain instead of love, with bitterness instead of pride. She had prayed she was wrong. Now the truth had split her heart open. Her cries echoed down the hall, reaching even Charles in his study. For the first time in years, the master of the house did not storm in to silence her. He sat behind his desk, staring at a decanter of brandy, his reflection warped in the glass. His empire, his authority, his control, it was all crumbling, and the instrument of his undoing was not a rival tycoon or a failed deal. It was a horse. By midday, the sheriff rode up the mansion drive. Sheriff Alden was not a man easily swayed by gossip, but when half the town repeated the same story, and when servants presented the same account word for word, he had no choice but to act. "Mr. Davenport," the sheriff said firmly, stepping into the study. "I've come to ask about last night." Charles leaned back in his leather chair, feigning calm. "Ask away." "There are claims," Alden continued, "that you attempted to harm your son. That you cast him into the river." Charles laughed, a cold, brittle sound. "Claims? From servants? From stable hands? Sheriff, surely you know better than to put stock in the ramblings of those beneath me." But the sheriff did not laugh. Instead, he nodded to the doorway. The maid entered, carrying Samuel, the infant swaddled safely. Behind her, the stable boy and 2 housemaids stood, eyes unflinching. And outside, through the tall windows, Silas was visible in the paddock, his white coat gleaming like a beacon. "They all tell the same story," Alden said. "And I'll tell you plain, Charles, if it were only their word against yours, perhaps the town would be torn. But that horse of yours—" Charles stiffened. "What about the horse?" Alden's voice grew low. "I walked the banks myself this morning. I saw the tracks, hoof prints leading into the river, then claw marks where he fought the current, drag lines where he pulled himself and the child out. Every mark matches their story. It's all written in the mud." The room fell silent. The twist of fate was undeniable. Charles's own prized horse had not only saved the life he tried to erase but had left behind the evidence that sealed his guilt. By evening, the townsfolk had gathered in the square. It was not a formal trial, but in places like Willow Creek, public judgment was as binding as any courtroom. The sheriff stood at the center, with Eleanor seated nearby, Samuel in her arms, Silas at her side. The horse had been led there by the stable boy, and though he was weary, he stood proudly, as if he understood the gravity of his role. His mane shimmered in the fading sun, and when Samuel fussed, Silas lowered his head, breathing softly until the baby quieted. The crowd murmured in awe. Charles was brought forward, his wrists bound loosely. He tried to speak, to appeal to reason, to wealth, to the pride he once commanded. "Do you truly believe the word of servants over mine?" he shouted. "Do you believe an animal's actions prove anything? I am Davenport. Without me, this town would be nothing." But no one cheered. No one bowed. Eleanor rose, pale but resolute, her voice carrying across the square. "Without you, this town would still have honesty. Without you, my son would still have a father. Instead, he is only a savior, and it is not you." Gasps rippled through the crowd. For years, Eleanor had been seen as quiet, fragile, resigned. But now her voice was sharp, unbreakable. She turned to Silas, resting her free hand on his neck. "This horse has more humanity in him than the man I married." The people roared their agreement. Some shouted for Charles to be locked away, others demanded he be stripped of his fortune. The sheriff held up a hand, calming the noise. "There'll be no lynching here," he declared. "But make no mistake, Charles Davenport will face justice. He will answer for what he's done." And with that, the sheriff ordered Charles taken away. As the deputies led him through the crowd, Charles's eyes darted wildly. He had always believed money could bend truth, that fear could silence voices. But now the very people he'd ruled turned their backs. And at the edge of the square, Silas reared high, hooves slicing the air, neighing loud enough to rattle the windows. The timing struck like thunder. Charles stumbled, nearly falling, the crowd erupting in shouts. It was as though the horse himself had declared the verdict. Later, when people retold the story, they swore it wasn't the sheriff, nor even Eleanor, who sealed Charles's fate. It was that moment, the white horse rearing in defiance, that convinced everyone of his guilt. A beast, with no tongue to lie, had told the truth louder than any man could. The trial of Charles Davenport was brief, but its echoes lasted for decades. Though he attempted to use his wealth and influence to twist the narrative, the evidence was too plain, the witnesses too many, and the horse's courage too undeniable. The sheriff presented the hoofprints by the riverbank, the testimonies of the maids, the cries of the baby himself, and even the visible fear Charles had shown when Salas stood against him. The jury of townsfolk needed no deliberation. Their verdict was swift, guilty of attempted infanticide. The law sentenced Charles to a distant penitentiary, stripped of his estates, his rail contracts, his fine clothes, and his carefully curated reputation. On the day he was escorted out of Willow Creek, people gathered not to mourn but to bear witness. He was carried away in shackles, shouting of betrayal, of lies, of injustice. But no one listened anymore. The richest man in town had been undone by his own cruelty, and by the loyalty of a horse. A new beginning for Samuel. With Charles gone, Eleanor and Samuel were no longer shadows in their own home. Eleanor's health, though fragile, slowly recovered, strengthened by the relief of no longer living under her husband's reign. She devoted every breath to nurturing Samuel, who, though small and frail, proved stronger with each passing week. Doctors warned that his life would be a constant battle, that he might never grow as sturdy as other children. But Eleanor dismissed their grim predictions. She had seen what her son had survived, the icy grasp of the river, the cruelty of his own father, and she knew, this boy was meant to live. And he did. Against the odds, Samuel thrived. His laughter filled the mansion halls, his first steps came earlier than anyone expected, and when his voice finally rose strong enough to speak, the first word he formed was not mama nor papa. It was horse. He would point toward the paddock where Salas grazed and call, in his small voice, horse. The servants wept each time they heard it, for they knew the bond between the child and his savior ran deeper than blood. Salas, the silent hero. Life for Salas changed, too. Once simply a prized possession in Charles's stable, he became a legend in Willow Creek. Children would slip carrots through the fence rails, farmers tipped their hats when they passed him, and townsfolk spoke his name with reverence. But Salas remained unchanged. He asked for no glory. He did not strut or demand. He was content to stand in the sun, to graze in the fields, to nuzzle the boy who had been placed in his care by fate. Every morning, Eleanor would wheel Samuel's cradle to the paddock. Salas would approach, lowering his head gently into the boy's lap. Samuel's small fingers would clutch the coarse strands of mane, his laughter ringing like bells across the yard. The horse would stand utterly still, patient, protective, as though he knew his purpose was not yet complete. The people of Willow Creek began to call him the guardian. The fall of Charles Davenport left a hole in Willow Creek's hierarchy. For years, he had ruled with wealth and intimidation. But in his absence, the town discovered something stronger, unity. Neighbors helped Eleanor manage the estate, no longer fearful of a master's wrath. Farmers offered milk, seamstresses sewed clothes for Samuel, and the church organized collections to support the family. Where once the mansion had been a symbol of cold wealth, it became a place of warmth, shared by all. And at every gathering, Salas was there. At weddings, he was adorned with garlands of wildflowers. At harvest festivals, children painted his likeness on banners. He was not just a horse, he was a living reminder that compassion could rise from the most unexpected places, that justice sometimes galloped on four legs. Years later. Time moved on, and Samuel grew into a boy of 10. Though he remained smaller than his peers, his spirit was indomitable. He rode Salas bareback through the meadows, his laughter carrying on the wind. Townsfolk would pause to watch, the boy and the horse, bound by a story that had become legend. Eleanor would stand on the porch, tears in her eyes, watching them together. She knew the shadows of the past would always linger, but they no longer held her captive. She had traded fear for hope, grief for gratitude. Sometimes, Samuel would ask about his father. Eleanor would pause, then answer gently. Your father lost his way. He thought wealth was worth more than love. But you, my darling, you were saved because love is stronger. And you will grow knowing that truth. Samuel would nod, as though he understood more than his years allowed, and he would wrap his arms tighter around Silas's neck. On the 15th anniversary of the river night, the townsfolk gathered once more in the square. By then, Samuel was nearly grown, Eleanor's hair had silvered, and Silas, though older, still carried himself with quiet pride. That day, they unveiled a statue, a bronze likeness of the white horse, frozen mid-leap, mane flowing, muscles taut, eyes blazing. At the base, an inscription read, "To Silas, who showed us that loyalty has no tongue, yet speaks louder than gold." The crowd cheered, tears streaming down many faces. Samuel, standing tall beside his mother, placed his hand on Silas's mane as the townsfolk applauded. The horse bowed his head, as if in humble acknowledgement. In the years to come, stories of that night would spread beyond Willow Creek. Travelers would stop to hear the tale of the horse who saved a newborn from the river, who defied his master, who stood as witness when human courage failed. Parents would tell it to their children as a lesson, not only of cruelty's downfall but of loyalty's triumph. And Samuel Davenport, the boy who should not have survived, grew into a man who carried that lesson in everything he did. He became known not for his wealth, but for his kindness. And at his side, until the end, was Silas, the horse who had written his first chapter with an act of impossible bravery. Because sometimes, the truest measure of humanity is not found in those who hold power, but in those who choose compassion, even when they cannot speak it. And in Willow Creek, they would always remember. A man's cruelty nearly ended a life, but a horse's loyalty saved it, and changed them all forever.